A warm welcome back to the show. My name is Tom, and this is Get Nuanced with TJC. Thank you in advance for tuning in to this segment, which I have been meaning to get to for quite a long time. Fortunately, however, this story has been evolving as I've been as much delaying its official coverage on this show. And maybe that was for a reason. I mean, everything seemingly happens for a reason, as cliche as that might sound. But as someone who does believe in higher powers, at least maybe not in the form of a specific man-like monotheistic deity, maybe not something that specific. However, I do believe, whether it be that or a multitude of different deities from, whether it be, take your pick, whether it be from the East or the West, and there are plenty to choose from. Many can come to mind. As someone who was brought up as a Roman Catholic, who doesn't necessarily 100% have faith in that particular religion, but has a great degree of respect and at least admiration when it comes to the historical and theological basis of the Roman Catholic faith and Christianity as a whole, at least when it comes to being able to apply an understanding of how Christianity has influenced not just history on a macro level, but how it allowed me to be here speaking English to you today as someone who was born in Seoul, Korea, and somehow is a native English speaker nonetheless, who was brought up by two Roman Catholics. And I can get into that specific story, in another segment, but I think, if anything, it's important to understand, not just from a macro level, but even on a micro level, how these things interplay with our own lives and why they are things that are beyond just what are in a book or an idea that one might, adhere to, whether genuinely or cynically for a personal or political agenda. I think that the knowledge that we can derive from understanding these things from a objective, or as much of an objective position as possible, when one can take a step back and analyze them for what they are. And whether I believe or not in Christianity, it is without a doubt, whether you do or not, that it is an important religion that has ultimately shaped much of mankind's destiny, and that is for better and for worse. And as somebody who also doesn't want to dismiss the other religions of the world, whether they be Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, there's so many that come to mind, Judaism, etc., etc. These things are all how we can, in an abstract sense, make sense of not just how we as humans exist, but as well as the physical realm that ultimately we exist within. And hopefully that doesn't sound super duper like a science paper or too technical. I don't want to go on a tangent, but I want to stress why these things are important, and why I have taken the time to explain all this is because it is something that very much is going to be something I segue back into after I get deeper into this broader topic, as it has been a major variable and will continue to be. And whether that is for its literal truth or not, I don't think, regardless, that is something that will, one way or the other, downplay its importance. So, anyways, what am I trying to get into here, which is something that I've been delaying on, and that is the ongoing geopolitical conflict in Ukraine. And ostensibly, at least when it comes to the de jure understanding of things, it is between Ukraine and the Russian Federation, or as we know them, the Russians, Russia, the Ruskies, as some of us may call them, as someone from an American point of view might, look at them maybe not as fondly, as they are at the moment, the major antagonist in this conflict, and as someone who is willing to take the circumstances for what they are, I want to be able to also acknowledge that America is very much my country, the country that I am creating this podcast from, and show, depending on which platform you tune into this on. But depending on whatever it is, America, nonetheless, as I've tried to, set the stage for, is very much a major, mover and shaker here. And if it wasn't for America and NATO, more broadly speaking, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which America is de facto the head of. I mean, there's other major militaries, such as the Turks, and as well as the French, ostensibly in some ways. I mean, they have a history of leaving, coming back, and, wanting to assert their own sort of independent foreign policy. But that could be something that we talk about in another segment. But, along with them, who could forget the United Kingdom, which I'm meaning to talk about the Queen, which I'll get back to in another segment, and also how I want to really connect that, her recent passing, Elizabeth II, who had passed back in September last month, with my video that I was going to do in podcast about Manuel II Paleologos, who was the only Byzantine or Roman emperor to visit the island of Britain or Britannia since Honorius had formally allowed the province, or at least maybe not formally, but one way or another, at least de facto, had allowed the province of Roman Britain to break away. And, not to go on too much of a tirade, but when it comes to the situation here in Europe, which is a very complicated one, to say the least, and one that I think Americans in particular are easy enough to, with our own sort of American-centric worldview, to not be as familiar with as maybe our forefathers had been previously, especially the founders being of originally, Anglo-Saxon Protestant stock, whom originally had their, roots from England or Great Britain in particular. America was originally the 13 colonies up until 1776, and the American Revolution, which another topic for another day, which is one that if you're at least interested in this type of thing, I'm sure you're already familiar with. But needless to say, it's something that I think in particular is something I wanted to mention just to give a sense of the situation here. But with America here being the de facto major benefactor of Ukraine, providing, keep in mind, Russia's annual military expenditure is $65 billion, and America has been giving in the less than February 24th, when this conflict had started, February 24th, 2022. Today, as I'm recording, it is October 1st, 2022, but we have since that time, which has almost been 7 months, almost half a year now, we've provided hundreds of billions of dollars. The number in particular is lost on me at the moment. I'm sorry about that. I'll annotate that in the description, but regardless, it is a huge amount, dwarfing Russia's annual spending, and with the, equipment such as the HIMARS and other vital, the Javelin Stinger missiles and other sort of key weapons that the United States and UK have been providing to Ukraine, they had been able to prevent Moscow, which is, led by Vladimir Putin, to prevent him from being able to blitzkrieg into Ukraine, which I think that was initially the goal, which was to bum rush Ukraine, Kyiv, and be able to take the capital, or at least oust Zelenskyy and replace him with someone akin to Viktor Yanukovych, who was the more Russia-aligned, sort of vassal, or I guess, Russia-leaning political figure prior to 2014 and the Maidan Revolution, the Revolution of Dignity, as some call it in the West. The Russians refer to it as a coup. And I mentioned that just to provide a sense of perspective, as I'm going to get into it in a little bit, but it's important to keep in mind, and I'm going to get into it in order to analyze these things coherently, the Russian point of view, because I think if we're only talking about things from a Western or an American-centric in particular point of view, it can easily be lost upon us understanding the, motivations and the broader historical context to not only what brought us here, but what the future will hold ultimately. As, the present, as we are speaking right now, was at one point the future for those living in the past. And for understanding the future, as they always say, it's easy to look at things in hindsight, but foresight is what ultimately is something that is a thing that we can't really ascertain in particular until, unfortunately, it is too late, unless we have the capacity to analyze based off of previously introduced information. And even then, I mean, at the end of the day, even those who are like myself analyzing these things in a, I'd like to say professional capacity, but maybe even so, those who are casually, observing these too. But ultimately, we are operating with a limited amount of information, and no matter how much we have of an understanding of these situations, things can always be, there's always contingencies and externalities that might not be something that we can grasp until after they've developed, and that would be hindsight, But I mean, foresight in particular is something that I am concerned with, not just from a political point of view, from domestic affairs, as someone who's going to talk about soon the recent Hurricane Ian that, as someone living in Florida, has affected us, and I think why this is a good example, of why we need to have foresight when it comes to infrastructure and planning to mitigate the worst effects of climate change. But in particular, when it comes to foreign policy, understanding the fate of nations and ultimately the post-1945, Bretton Woods world order that the United States, or at least Washington policymakers, have spearheaded and have championed. And as someone who lives within that orbit, I think, crucially, this is something that is, with foresight, what we need to be able to make sense of in order to try to gauge what the world of tomorrow is going to bring, as I think we are living in a period of transition. And I'm going to get back into that really quickly in a second, because the situation on the ground in Ukraine has been evolving, and I've been meaning to get to this segment in particular, but I've been super busy, not to mention with just the hurricane, but my girlfriend in particular had started a job in school. I've been, with her moving a couple of times, and shout out to her, a friend that I've become friends with, in particular, he knows who he is, who has helped us out along the way. I mean, I might link some stuff if he decides to, promote something of his. I offered to do so because he had helped us out with moving and whatnot. But there'd been a lot of stuff that we've been doing, in the past few months that have been holding me up. But fortunately, this event has been evolving, and it's not like it's gone stale. And as of yesterday, which was Friday, September 30th, 2022, Russia has, under Putin, formally annexed the 4 regions that they've been able to, not 100%, but through at least, for the most part, I mean, at least in a large enough chunk, had been able to gain control over. And those are the regions of Kherson, Luhansk, Donetsk, and Zaporizhia. And I might have butchered the last one. Sorry about that. I am not a native Ukrainian or Russian speaker, as you're probably able to tell. But this is a major sort of escalation and a sign that things are far from ramping down, but are very much going to be ramped up. And from what many are fearing, including myself, which I am far more sort of bullish on this, which my particular take I'm going to get into in a moment. But it's something that I think is going to result in things heating up even further, and what's going to make the previous crisis that I think is comparable, and what many have been comparing it to, such as the Cuban Missile Crisis between the Kennedy administration and Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Union at the time, which was the Russian Federation's historic predecessor up until 1991, the former Soviet Union. It's going to make that look like peanuts by comparison, and that was one of those 30 seconds to midnight events that could have seen a conflagration that would have resulted in this podcast and everything that we know and love to have not even taken ever place. And that is something to ponder. And if one wants to take a step back and really appreciate the fleeting nature of life and how these topics really do, when you study them and really think about them and appreciate them, they really show how, sort of fleeting and short life is. And what we take for granted oftentimes, the simple things that we, especially myself, have only been able to appreciate after the fact many of the times, especially, the good times of me when I was coming of age, as I almost am turning 26 as of 10 days from now. And as someone who is, wanting to hopefully contribute towards creating a world that is better for future generations than the one that was, left to us to inherit, someone like myself who's a millennial or Gen Z, maybe a zillennial, on that border, I would like to, obviously understand these topics and be able to make sense of them, and hopefully help those who are tuning into this type of segment be able to do the same. And mentioning the previous things when it comes to this conflict right now was done to try to build up a sort of, I'm sure if you're keeping up with this, you are already familiar with some of these things. And I will link some references down below, but it's important to give context. And I wanted to give this sort of background right now as I now dwell into the overall meat and potatoes of this. And this is going to require us being able to step in the shoes of someone whom is definitely being much vilified, and for some justifiable reasons from a humanitarian and American-centric point of view, especially a Western-centric point of view as well. But in order to understand these things, sometimes it will require us to not only, oppose an enemy, but also to respect and be able to put ourselves in their shoes. And whether it be ourselves or that of Putin, who I'm going to want to, I guess to a degree psychoanalyze and try to imagine if for a moment I was him or one of us were him and we're making the decisions as the, one at the helm of the ship of state in the Kremlin for the Russian Federation, and has been given this, for better and for worse, position, whether it be by the grace of God or whether it be due to, some sort of divine providence or through sheer luck or through his, competency and efficiency as a former KGB, agent who is able to rise up through the ranks, as someone who actually grew up in a time that was, maybe not exactly like this, but not too long ago, and maybe similar in the sense that it was a time of transition, as he had famously been a mid-level bureaucrat in the KGB during the 1980s and stationed in East Germany, particularly Dresden, which was the site where he actually had witnessed at the time the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was that sort of historic moment. I'm sure everybody, growing up, I remember hearing in history class the famous phrase from Ronald Reagan, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." And he actually passed recently, Mikhail Gorbachev, whom I'd like to talk about maybe just a little bit, in a few. But hold that thought and let's bookmark that, because to, get back to the crux here of what I was trying to talk about in the sense of Russia and America here, which is, I think, ultimately the main two, by proxy, competitors in this situation, as America has gone all in to defend Ukraine and provide, or not defend Ukraine in the sense of, militarily, but at least everything up into direct military intervention, including, sending military aid in the form of weapons and equipment, which arguably could be considered an act of war, which I would argue is so, even though I do support the, aid that has been provided. And I do think, as someone, maybe it's due to the fact that I'm of Korean origin and I'm from my own, area of the world, which is a place of geopolitical tension that is still yet to be resolved. As someone who maybe, can sympathize and understand where Ukraine's coming from, as, Korea and I think Ukraine have some significant overlap. Maybe even Korea, Vietnam, and Ukraine. We could get into that in a little bit, but with the first Cold War having a similar sort of situation where it was a sort of proxy battlefield, at least at the earliest stages, actually even until the end, when you count Afghanistan and the Mujahideen and that whole sort of thing, which is its own topic for another time. I talked about a little bit in my previous segment regarding the situation in Afghanistan, which I unfortunately didn't follow up on enough, but I'll definitely talk about it, in another segment, not to get too much off the rails here, as I've, talked about so many other things, and I want to focus on this type of thing and get all my thoughts out here, because this is something that is of interest, and I want to provide my perspective on this, as it is something that I think hopefully is a benefit to you all, and is maybe a sort of breath of fresh air, relatively speaking, compared to some of the more typical, sort of perspective we see, which it's very easy to demonize, the enemies of ours, whether it be Putin or Xi or one of these other folks. And I could be guilty sometimes in talking about these types of things of being a little bit tribalistic. But in order to take a step back and to understand these people and what motivates them, being a leader of a country is something that requires intelligence, competency, and is a responsibility. As the famous quote came from Uncle Ben in Spider-Man, not to be such a nerd, but I remember, with great power comes great responsibility. And I mean, I know it comes from a comic book, and God bless Stan Lee, rest in peace, but it is true. And I think that it is something in order to understand and appreciate. And I mean, we're talking about the movers and shakers of history here. And at least when it came to Putin, who had witnessed the crumbling of the USSR and of its satellite state in East Germany, and the reduction of the historic areas that not just the Soviet Union, but the previous Tsarist empire of Russia had been able to, reach at its zenith, and to then watch as Russia's borders and influence receded back into, what it is up until today, when it had been able to, or up until the last, 2 decades, when it had been able to, during the Georgian, wars in 2006, 2007, 2008, I believe, with southern Ossetia and Abkhazia, and then in Ukraine in 2014, following the Maidan and the exile of Yanukovych and that whole sort of debacle, the annexation of Crimea with the strategic port of Sevastopol, and then the formation of these breakaway separatist republics, the Donetsk People Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, which have now been formally annexed, as I mentioned before, into the Russian Federation. That whole thing has obviously been something that is a product of Putin's desire to restore the glory of the Russian Empire. And I want to get into this a little bit more now, because I'm sure you've heard that from other people, but to understand really where Putin's coming from when it comes to his motivations, which we obviously can't, pick apart his brain quite literally, but I think we can do much up to that point with the benefit of having the internet and information, which I will link below, referenced, to try to provide a sort of, perspective here of his, as it's easy to demonize, as I mentioned before, but it's much harder to be able to put ourselves in another person's shoes. And whether you're a Russian like Putin or an American like myself, I think to want to, be able to fill the shoes of one's forefathers is never an easy task. And with Putin in particular, the footsteps he walks on as a leader of Russia, which historically was, for better and for worse, and whether we liked it or not, a great power, and was one of the major countries for the last 300 years, or even before then. Following the Great Northern War, when Russia was able to defeat, I think it was Sweden's, I know the song's Carolus Rex, but it's about, shout out to Sabaton. They're a great band. I got to see them live, but it was Charles XII, I believe. Maybe the wrong number. I know it was his name was Charles, but following his defeat, and he was someone who came very close. If it wasn't for that incident where he had, maybe died from friendly fire during, his attempt to fight against Peter the Great, whom is actually someone who Putin himself likens himself to, in particular, but. Is someone, we should get back to in a moment, but when it comes to the conflict at that time, the Great Northern War, and Russia's victory there, they had been able to, ever since, become a great power. And, following Peter the Great's, expansion into what is today modern Finland, and, what was then Congress Poland following the Napoleonic situation, Russia had been able to exercise a lot of influence historically, and nowadays, as the Russian Federation is but a shadow of its former self. And as someone myself who is growing up in a period of great transition, where the world, at least as much as I understood it growing up, as someone who had the privilege of doing so in the 2000s in New York City, and I can still remember 9/11 in particular, which is a subject that I could talk about in its own segment. But as somebody who sees the world as I knew it changing on a fundamental level, and wanting to look towards the future and ensure that the prosperity of America, the country I was brought up within, is guaranteed in one way or another, I can more than empathize with Putin as someone who I can definitely tell is a Russian patriot. As much as I oppose his, escapades in Ukraine, I can at least respect his, and admire to an extent, his will. How far will he go? It's a good question, and I want to get into that in a little bit, but when it comes to his desire to restore the pride of the Russian nation and to, what he believes is correct the wrongs and the historical, anomaly of what became the, the country of Ukraine, which Putin, according to his own essay, I mean, he published it a while ago, I'll link it below, doesn't even acknowledge the, Russia, this right for Ukraine. I personally believe Ukraine should have the right for self-determination, but he himself, for the reasons he outlined in this essay of his, this sort of treatise, he hasn't recognized this separate sort of statehood for Ukraine. And, I mean, the cats are in the background, by the way. I'm sorry about that. They're doing their thing. But to get back to this right now with Putin here in particular, he doesn't recognize the separate sort of, capacity of Ukraine as a different, distinct peoples from Russia. He recognizes that Belarus, which are the White Russians, Russia, as they call it, and Ukraine, as just being of one common people and one common heritage. And that historically, at least from a political sort of perspective, could potentially be argued as though maybe, listen, I think ultimately it's a flawed logic, since just because it was the case at one time, many countries, especially even America, for example, had been a part of, Great Britain, the British Empire. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it will always remain that way. And right now, the current dispute is predicated on the fate of whether that will be the case or whether Putin's perspective and thesis will be right. I mean, this conflict is ultimately the present, going to shape how future generations, if there are going to be one, provided that we all don't, we aren't all wiped out via nuclear hellfire, which is something that I'm going to get into in a moment, which is a possibility, unfortunately, as alarming as that might sound. And when it comes to the future, future generations will be learning about our current present, and that will be the past at that point. And obviously, in order to get to that point in the future, we're going to be seeing playing out a whole sort of fiasco here that has, already been a huge, sort of catastrophe from a humanitarian level, with millions of refugees and an ongoing energy crisis for the many countries in the European Union who had been reliant previously on Russian gas via the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 pipeline, or the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. The Nord Stream 2 was built but never able to fully go online, and was something that Washington policymakers, in particular for very valid reasons, I believe, were opposed to. But unfortunately, the situation recently, there was the Nord Stream 1 explosion, or sort of, I think it looks like a sabotage, and it looks like it was intentionally wrecked. I'm not going to say one way or the other. I can't say, because I don't have, and I'm not privy to all the information, and neither is anybody, I don't think, in particular. So let's not pretend like we are, until further information comes out. But when it comes to that situation, something happened, and looks like there was some man-made intervention there that has caused it to be permanently out of commission, barring some sort of extemporaneous circumstance where it could be fixed. But from the looks of it, and from what I've read, it looks like it is out of commission for good, due to the structural sort of damage to its capacity and the chemistry behind it, where with exposure to the salt water inside of these pipes, it looks like it has corroded. And again, I don't want to foolishly be somebody who is going to proclaim that it was one way or the other somebody. Everybody can speculate, and it's worth speculating, but I don't want to, as somebody who is trying to dedicate this topic, and maybe I will in the future try to ascertain and provide a concrete conclusion. I'm not trying to be a fence sitter, but I want to, for the sake of brevity, include the mention of that, but get back to the main crux of this discussion, which is ultimately the litany of issues. Even prior, there was even a potential grain crisis, as Ukraine and Russia are respectively two of the world's largest wheat exporters, and there are countries like those, many in Africa and Southeast Asia, that were potentially facing a food shortage and crisis. We are still reeling from the coronavirus pandemic when it comes to the socioeconomic impacts, and the supply chains are still, out of whack, and inflation, at least in the United States and many other countries in the world, contrary to some who blame it on one particular person, whether it be Biden or Trump or etc., it is a worldwide problem that is the result of economic factors that go beyond one particular political person or leader, and go to a sort of system-wide issue and upheaval. But that could be talked about at length in another discussion. And I'm not an economist in particular, but if I were to talk about that type of thing, I'd want to dedicate an entire subject to it. But just to mention those types of problems that exist here and, try to grasp how, significant this conflict is, as this is since the, World War II shaping up to be, yes, barring the, crushing of the Hungarian and Romanian resistance during the, period of the Warsaw Pact and, the Cold War. Barring that, this has been the largest scale conflict. I mean, it's called a special military operation still in Russia, despite their partial mobilization in lieu of the recent Ukrainian comeback when it came to retaking large swaths of the area of Kharkiv or Kharkov, depending on whether you're Ukrainian or Russian, and mounting an attempt also in the south gradually to take back Kherson, which is a geostrategically important location that would allow Ukraine, if it were to take it back, to prevent Crimea from having a guaranteed access to fresh water, and also be able to prevent the Sea of Azov from effectively what it is now have become, which is a de facto Russian lake, despite internationally it not being recognized as such. But when it comes to the situation here, and I hope that I provide enough information on this, it is important. We could talk about all the other variables at play, and I'll link references as I mentioned below. But ultimately, in order to try to ascertain, which is the main topic of this subject, what will happen next, I think it is important to put ourselves, again, as I was saying, in Putin's shoes. And as someone who, much to whatever we think about him, you can ascribe all sorts of things, and I could get into that in another subject, obviously, when it comes to my personal sentiments on him from an American point of view, as somebody who is an American patriot, first and foremost, who, foreign policy-wise, is more often than not critical of a lot of the things that the U.S. has been doing, and acknowledges that there is a level of imperialism when it comes to America and any great power, but is still nonetheless someone who wishes for the United States to be a force for good in the world and wants to at least do my part when it comes to elucidating the ins and outs of American foreign policy, at least from an American point of view, and also talking about domestic things from a candid perspective to the best of my capacity with what I have in terms of the limited information as someone who is, at best, an analyst and observer like you and anybody else watching this, who, listen or listening, depending on the segment or, platform that you're listening in on or watching it on. Sorry about that. I mean, what is it called? It is sometimes... I get into sort of this mode where I can talk about these things at length. But even at times, I might, I guess, from a, what is it called? I guess from a verbal point of view, trip and fall a couple of times. And I apologize when I do that. But hopefully you don't mind. And to get back here, speaking of tripping and falling, I think that Russia had, unfortunately, not really, fully expected this sort of situation as it's been unfolding. I mean, from what it looks like, the mobilization effort, the partial one, looks like it is not being received well by the domestic population from Russia. I'm sure that some people are signing up and are willing to volunteer to do so, but many people, looks like, at least the middle class and the sort of intelligentsia of Russia, are, especially those who are males like myself of fighting age, who could be drafted, are not too keen on that, whether you see it through the protest or the fleeing that we've seen of many from, whether it be the border to Georgia, which they don't seem too keen on. They might be a little bit changing they might be looking to change some of the flow of people coming in and out, whether it be through Finland, which is still, as of the time of me recording this, still allowing, and it's the last European Union NATO country, I believe, not NATO, it's not in NATO, it's in the EU, I believe, but it's looking to join NATO along with Sweden, as I mentioned before in another podcast, provided that the Turks are able to provide, Turkey is able to have some sort of amicable situation, as there is tensions with the two of those countries when it comes to the Kurds and their involvement with certain Kurdish groups and whatnot. But that's another topic again for another segment, but something worth mentioning. And Turkey's role is definitely important in this. But when it comes to Putin in particular here, who has, I think, very much so put most of his legacy, and I think will be, at least in terms of the present time, and maybe even in for the long haul, be defined, his tenure in the last 20 years of power, or at least since 1999 when he was prime minister. I mean, he has been, obviously, in one way or another in the, seat of power, or at least, at the helm of the ship of state, whether it be through officially or through, him rotating as prime minister to adhere to at least the de jure, mandates of the Constitution of the Russian Federation. There was a time under Obama, and I think the end of Bush's tenure, where Dmitry Medvedev, who, rotates with him, was the president of Russia, and Putin had rotated back to being prime minister. But, like Erdogan and others, there's, that type of thing happening. I mean, but who am I to judge, as somebody who I do believe that there should be term limits, and at least when it comes to, America's system of government, but when it comes to other countries, and maybe as a, an effective sort of governance sort of system as a whole, separating myself from my own sort of upbringing in America, I can understand why there would be, and not necessarily obviously be 100% of the time, potentially sometimes where autocratic powers might be needed, especially when there is a crisis or a period of upheaval where, somebody who might need more than just 4 to 8 years and less of an incentive to worry about, when it comes to elections or, parliamentary procedures or congressional procedures, where they would need to have the authority to step in line and step up and be able to assert sort of, order if things got out of hand in a chaotic capacity. But, listen, we can talk about that in another segment, and that's something why, again, I'm not a huge fan of this whole sort of democracy versus autocracy framework that many Washington policymakers seem to champion, as somebody who looks at the benefits of different systems and doesn't try to be like, oh, democracy good or bad 100% or autocracy good or bad. I think, and as someone who is definitely skeptical of democracy, and is open to some of the benefits of autocracy, but still skeptical to obviously not want to fall into some sort of cult of personality or, worshipping of one leader or strongman, as we can tell with Putin here, who is very much in that sort of latter category and fits that archetype, or at least tries to, and has been able to for a while. I think he was trying to repeat the same sort of success he had in 2014 with Crimea. And I might have mentioned it in other podcasts, but I think maybe in hindsight, he might have wanted to keep the pressure, maybe have done what he did now back then, considering that as someone who had been able to predict, I think, accurately that this was going to happen when it came to the invasion. At least I thought so as of the, halfway through 2021. It looked like, especially with COVID, I think if COVID didn't happen, he might have done it sooner. But if you look at the economic and demographic composition of Russia, ever since World War II, their male population had been screwed up because of the loss of so many men. And the fact that Russia's military in the long term does not look like it is going to remain as, formidable. I mean, it's not even as formidable as we thought it was. I mean, I think even America, to a large degree, whether it be through the influence of, the military-industrial complex, which every country has one of those, and for their own incentives, obviously, had been hyping up the threat of Russia, and for some good reasons. I mean, their intervention in Syria was decisive, and they had been able to expand. I mean, they're involved in the, guerrilla fighting on behalf of the Central African Republic to back their government against insurgents, and they've also been able to exercise much influence in their traditional area in Southeast and Central Asia. They're competing too between the Americans and the Chinese, obviously, or they were. I mean, that changes a lot. I'll get into that in a little bit, but when it comes to the situation with Russia being able to exercise a lot of influence, whether it be through as a guarantor of peace between Azerbaijan and Armenia, with the disputed Nagorno-Karabakh region and the Republic of Artsakh, which is something that has actually been a renewed sort of thing. I mean, we're seeing this as well. To get into a side note, in lieu of Russia's decrease in soft power and its effective, failure to be able to end this conflict quick and cleanly, I mean, they tried to do a blitzkrieg, and some people they're calling Putin Putler or whatever. I think that's such a dumb comparison, not really apt. But even if you were to try to extrapolate that, I mean, during World War II, the Nazis under Hitler were able to take Poland and France pretty quickly. I mean, they got bogged down in the Soviet Union, but Russia was not able to, take over Ukraine, what many thought would be. I mean, I predicted the conflict was going to happen a year beforehand, but I was definitely wrong excuse me, admittedly, with underestimating Ukraine's capacity for being able to resist. And I really admire Zelenskyy. I mean, listen, you can criticize some people are saying, oh, well, he has some oligarch funding, but I mean, he's a politician, listen, and he used to be an actor. And I mean, listen, at the end of the day, I mean, I'm not going to worship any particular politician, whether it be Putin, Biden, Trump, Zelenskyy, etc. I'm going to give you my perspective as somebody who is very cynical from politicians inherently, but still thinks that they are. I mean, there's always going to be a ruling class. There's always going to be elites on some level. Being able to accept certain things, the fact that I inherently believe in hierarchies as someone who is, on a social level, relatively conservative. I mean, not to get into the specifics. I mean, I could talk about how I'm actually pro-choice and this other things that I'll talk about on domestic affairs in another segment. But as someone who believes as a student of history and as someone who believes in the pitfalls of the human condition, and trying to transcend those is always something that I think is a noble effort, but to be conscious of the limitations of one's, species and oneself is always something, whether it be macro or micro, as I was just discussing for each, is something that should be kept in mind. But when it comes to, my bad, the situation with Russia and its failure to be able to, take over Ukraine, or at least the, I think, eastern half. I think its original goal was Russia's original goal was, or Putin's goal was to get into, launch this limited so-called special military operation with its initial 200,000 troops and to just overwhelm Ukraine to the point where it was just demoralized and Zelenskyy would hopefully flee the capital and they would be able to install Yanukovych. And I mean, initially that didn't work, obviously. Zelenskyy was willing to be steadfast, and the West was actually surprisingly able to unify together. I mean, if you would have told me this about NATO prior to this conflict, that's something that definitely surprised me. I mean, we went from Macron claiming that NATO was brain dead, and Trump obviously, saying the stuff that he said about NATO, oh my God, that's just another thing. I mean, him obviously being himself, and then obviously, just in general, the sort of malaise, I think the sense of meaning, the crisis of identity and meaning of NATO post its, triumph against the Warsaw Pact, the Warsaw Pact, and the Soviet Union, I think the competition, I mean, they say competition helps, both sides remain sharp, and I think that when the Soviet Union collapsed, this sort of, interlude that we had, 1991 to 2020, I'd say, this sort of, quote-unquote end of history that was, the thesis of the namesake book by Francis Fukuyama. And he had actually retracted that for good reasons, but we could talk about another segment. And obviously we had this period where there was this sense that Western liberal democracy, as the thesis of that book outlined, was the sort of here-all, end-all, the bee's knees, the cat's meow, etc., and that it was going to be the inherently, dominant ideology for time immemorial to come. And as someone who's brought up, in New York City in the shadow of 9/11, coming of age, remembering that event vividly, as well as the, sort of war on terror as a child, and remembering I had friends and family, friends who had been sent into service, and, definitely with that situation, someone who doesn't think we should have been in Afghanistan and Iraq, but once we were there, I think we could have handled the situation better, and definitely have some lessons that we could learn from that, as well as, the previous conflicts, such as the Vietnam War, when it came to our failure as, Americans from a foreign policy point of view. But we can talk about that in another segment, which is definitely worthwhile and is something that I want to be cognizant of. However, when it came to this period overall, I mean, even with the sort of, debacle in the Middle East, which is something that I think we should actively work on readjusting our relationship with the various factions there, as I talked about in some other podcasts, I think that ultimately we still have nonetheless been through this period of sort of unquestioned American supremacy, from a political point of view, and even economic. I mean, from every sort of facet. I mean, we sort of lived in this sort of American century, and where America had been able to be the hero and end all. And I think that that's something that must be understood when understanding Putin's motivations here. And that's why I want to get into what I think is going to come next, as I talked about just previously some of the groundwork again about what the conflict is, and I'm going to link below a live map of the conflict, and definitely don't want to discount the Ukrainian resistance here as someone who is definitely pro-America, especially during the Korean War and the situation when it happened here in Ukraine, I think there's a lot of parallels here, maybe not precisely, but similar ones when it comes to the fact that Ukraine is the sort of proxy battleground between the East and West, the Moscow and Washington respectively. And obviously the Western European countries have their roles. But overall, I think that in order to, understand these sort of broader abstracts, we need to also zoom in on the different, players in this conflict in particular. And obviously, Vladimir Putin is an integral one. As someone who is only a few years younger than my parents, who were born in 57 and 58 respectively, that being my mother and father, when it comes to Putin, who was born in 52, I believe on October 7th, he's about to turn in less than a week 70 at the time of this recording. So early happy birthday to Vladimir Putin. I mean, probably not as happy as his previous ones, but when it comes to him in particular and his upbringing, his father was actually a former cook for Stalin and Lenin and a veteran of the quote-unquote Great Patriotic War, which was, from their point of view, it was, I guess. I don't want to quote-unquote it, but from at least the American point of view, that was part of the broader theater, Eastern Front of World War II. And, the situation, obviously, with that, if anyone isn't aware of that, I recommend picking up a history book and maybe pausing this to refresh, because having an understanding of the 20th century, especially Russia's, or at least the Soviet Union, which was, Russia was, this Russian Socialist Soviet Republic was the main, overarching, ethnic faction and group that was at the helm of it. Obviously there were other groups within it, ethnic groups within it, including Ukrainians. But, Zelensky's, I think, grandfather actually served in the Soviet army as well, the Red Army as well. But, not to get too much off the sidetrack, not to get too sidetracked here, just to mention how, this is something in the 20th century that is one of those ghosts that in order to, understand the specter of Russia and its sort of, implications of what might happen next. And I'm going to talk about the nuclear situation here in a few moments, but it's important, obviously, to understand how we got here. And in the 20th century, I recommend, if you haven't already, refreshing if you haven't, about World War II, which is its own discussion in and out itself. But to get back to the situation with the, Soviet Union, which had lost millions and millions, far more scores of soldiers, and is one of the reasons why Russia's demographic situation is still to this day very much FUBAR, and is one of the impetuses to why now of all times was, or at least in the last year, was the time where this invasion had started, and why I think, at least from Putin's point of view, it was now or never. And Putin had grown up in Moscow as somebody who was, the son of war veterans, and like my parents were, actually, to a degree, at least from the American side here. My mother's side had served in the Pacific Theater, and my father's side, actually getting a Silver Star from Omar Bradley himself, had served in the European Theater, the Western Front. But to talk about that in another segment, and it's something that definitely is a point of pride, and it's something I'm sure that had influenced Putin to be very patriotic. He himself had grown up with the inspiration, at least according to him, from watching different movies like James Bond and others, to want to be a, sort of KGB agent. I'm sure Russia had its own version of James Bond. Maybe he didn't watch James Bond in particular, but I think he did. And I think there's Russian equivalents to that. And he was somebody who, as I mentioned before, was stationed in Dresden at the time of the end of the Cold War, and had grown up in a time where Russia was, coming of age, still one of the main two superpowers in the world, vying for supremacy a la the Cold War. And Russia, I was mentioning this to my girlfriend recently, the fact that her mother actually spoke Russian, and, in faraway places such as Vietnam, and the fact that Russia was, and still is to a huge extent, maybe less so in the wake of its failures in Ukraine, a behemoth in terms of its influence and legacy as a historical great power. And I think one that is definitely in a state of decline right now. And Putin in particular wants to stem that decline. And I think, as someone who was brought up in this period of profound transition, he even himself had cited that he believed that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, which is often cited by Western observers, but is still nonetheless the case true. And he said he would never forget the day when he was in Dresden waiting for Moscow, to give word on what to do, and there was no, response from Moscow, and that had a profound and traumatic effect on his psyche and how he would then further operate in the future as he rose up the political ranks. as initially somebody with a minor role, and then being able to, wheel and deal all the way through to being prime minister in 1999. And, the rest is obviously recent history, which we talked about in another segment. But to understand Putin's upbringing and his sort of perspective here, I think, is key. And if I were him in particular, and this is where we're going to do some psychoanalysis and mental exercising, forgive me for the, sort of approach for doing this, but I think it's important. As someone, if I had to put myself in his shoes, as the leader of a declining superpower, or at least one that had the ambitions to still be a superpower, and was up until very recently, I think, much like Byzantium, which I want to get into in a little bit, during the time of Basil II, or maybe Alexios I. I think Putin, if anything, the monarch that I would compare him the most to is actually Alexios I Komnenos, who was, someone who was able to stem the, crises that his predecessors had, he had inherited from his predecessors as he succeeded Nikephoros III Proteniades, I think, in particular. And, he was an emperor of Byzantium in the wake of Manzikert in 1071 and the defeat of Romanos IV Theogenes, and that saw the loss of Anatolia to the Seljuk Turks, and those were the predecessors, obviously, to the Ottoman Turks. But at the time, Alexios had been able to stem the tide, and then been able to, shrewdly make use of the sort of, Christian, solidarity that the Orthodox East had with the Catholic West at the time, which only had recently been a schism in 1054, and it wasn't, I think, at the time as, permanent. There wasn't the sense of permanency as there would be, at least in hindsight now, almost 1,000 years later from that time. And I think, this is also before the 1204 sack by the West, and, the sort of perspective, I'm sure that shaped Putin's view of things in Russia too, of how the West had, sort of, double dealed with Byzantium, and through, the machinations of the Venetians had, sacked the, capital of the Byzantine Empire, which was, the inheritor of, and was the direct continuation of the Roman Empire in the East, which is something I talked about in other segments. But before that, with Alexios I Komnenos, who had come to power, and, at the end of the 11th century, and had been able to, or at the end of the, it was the 11th century, I believe, and had been able to effectively, yes, it was 1000 AD, yeah, it was the 11th century, I believe, and he had been able to, sort of restore at least the soft power of Byzantium, and it had been able to exercise its capacity as a great power thanks to the intervention of the Crusades and the restoration of much of Anatolia to the control of the Byzantines, which still had control at the time of the Balkans, which were, this area that it was using as its recruitment ground. But ultimately, it was sort of a, temporary respite, and it was only stemming what was eventually the long-term collapse of the Byzantine Empire, as the events I talked about, just a few seconds ago, had happened after. But at the time, Alexios I Komnenos was able to project strength through sheer force of his personality and through his own shrewd, strategical wherewithal. And this was something that, at least, from the outside at the time, might have seemed like, just like Basil II, as he compared himself to Vasil Bolganatortos, who is the Bulgar slayer. Probably butchered that. I can't pronounce that. I'm not even trying to even speak Greek, let alone Bulgarian. My bad. But he would, not have that same sort of structural foundation as Basil did, which allowed Basil to, have the sort of conquest he had made all the way to Antioch in what is today modern Turkey, Anatolia, and it was at the time part of Syria, and what was, a, complete reconquest of the Balkans, including the annexation of the Bulgarian Empire. And that was something that, is, I think, in hindsight, something that we should keep in mind when looking at the situation in Ukraine. I think there's a lot of parallels, not 100%, but with Putin in particular, I think that he likened himself to Peter the Great, which is ironic considering that Peter the Great was a westernizer and somebody who, founded St. Petersburg and was very much so. I mean, he relocated the capital from Moscow to St. Petersburg, much like Constantine relocated the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to Constantinople, sort of parallel to that. And I think that, I mean, he even had a tax, I think, for his own courtiers who didn't shave their faces, as he, saw that as more in vogue of the style, which is interesting. I mean, Putin's clean shaven too, but I mean, so are a lot of politicians, I think, in general. But Russians, I know, are one of the ones who historically, I mean, there's a lot of leaders, I think, like Ivan the Terrible and others before, who had, beards and whatnot. And that's something I think could be talked about in its own segment. Sort of the political. The political practices behind facial hair and even just the aesthetics in general. But not to get too much into a tirade here, to get back into the main crux of this. There's so many, twists and turns here. I mean, not to be structuring this podcast in a very, show in a very Byzantine way, but I'll try to help myself here. And when it comes to Putin in particular, I think that his sort of, approach here, and it's very much this sort of, approach of somebody who is trying to salvage what it was, the, remnants of the Soviet Union's soft and hard power. And I mean, the fragmentation of the Soviet Union, I mean, as someone who's an American, obviously, it was, sort of like a distant thing, at least as an average citizen. But for those in Eastern Europe, this was a profound altering of the geopolitical landscape. And on a very deep level, it shook the very core of society for the Russians, and had, what was the right word? It had rolled back centuries of what I mentioned before, Soviet and then prior Tsarist expansion. I mean, more so the Tsarist one. I mean, the Soviet Union lasted less amount. It existed less duration than my own grandmother, who was born in 1919, and only passed in 2018, which is crazy to think. There are people who are alive that were able to see the beginning and end of what was a state that was looking to exist throughout the ages and saw itself as a key power, and one that was vying against the U.S. for global supremacy, whether it was in the field of the sciences, like with the space race in the 60s with Sputnik, and then, NASA launching, all that type of thing, which was something that was historic and could be talked about in its own segment. And then obviously on the, military front, as well as, the development of different weapons like the hydrogen Tsar bomb and other weapons, as well as the vying for influence across the world, whether it be in South America, which was America's own backyard in the form of Cuba, and nowadays in Venezuela. And then in the case of back then, when it came to the Middle East, such as with them backing Gamal Nasser in Egypt against, what was Israel during the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War, respectively, as well as the situation in Africa as well. There was the situation, I think, with Angola, as well as the situation in Asia. Who could forget? I mean, this is something that plays deeply, at least in my personal life, when it comes to the Korean War and the Soviet Union's backing of Kim Il-sung and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and, the situation, obviously, in Vietnam as well. And I mean, needless to say, they had a role in even the Chinese Civil War between the Kuomintang, the nationalists, and which fled to Taiwan in 1949, which is something I talked about a lot, and I want to get back into in its own segment. But just to highlight it, as again, they backed the Communist Party under Mao Zedong, and it is such an irony. That Russia now, for all Putin's efforts, I think that for structural reasons, even though he, I think from his point of view, tried to take advantage of what he perceived as a moment of weakness from the West at a time where, following, the still ongoing pandemic, which was now still lingering, but back then was still sort of more severe at the beginning of this year, and is only still, really waning, I think, especially over here in Florida, you might be forgiven if you are, counter people who don't even believe in the virus or, are, not thinking it's that big of a deal. But when it comes to even the economic effects, whether the virus itself from a public health perspective is discussed or not, that is something that has definitely caused upheavals in the supply chains, and has definitely been something through the demanded historical action, whether it be domestically, for a moment to get into the CARES Act, and the stimulus packages, which were like 30 or 40% of all the US dollars ever produced to tackle that in the United States. I mean, and other countries had passed similar, I mean, obviously proportionally to their own sort of budget and country's scale. I mean, only America could pass a $6 trillion something dollar package, which a lot of it was, a corporate sort of, giveaway, but some of it did definitely go to helping people, including myself. And obviously others here, which I think was something that was definitely necessary, but underscores the fact that this was obviously a response to an unprecedented, global pandemic that especially had stricken the U.S. And Putin in particular, when it came to COVID, had been obviously sort of, trying to take protective measures. And I think there's speculation that he has some sort of health condition. I think he's healthier than some have been saying, where they think he's going to drop dead any day now. I don't think so. I mean, I believe he is healthier than that, but he might have. I mean, he's in his 70s almost. And I know that people in that age range, I mean, we're all going to reach that at some point, whether you're my age right now in your 20s or you're, somebody who is, older than me by decades or more. I mean, or even a few years. I mean, old age and the sort of afflictions that your body can have as it gradually decays. I mean, and you get ready to depart into whatever happens after this, whether there is something or not. I mean, who knows? But that's something that obviously is something that should be factored in, and is why he had been more prone to isolating himself and taking protective measures, which is understandable. There was even one photo op, I think, where he was wearing like some big hazmat suit, and I think that if Trump were to have done that and taken things more seriously, he might have actually been president right now. And he claims the Ukraine situation wouldn't have happened under his watch, which I doubt that. I don't think, regardless of who's president, I think this was something that was more so to do with Russia's goals. I don't think Russia calculates its broader foreign policy off of the rotating, who's the rotating names and faces that occupy the various branches of the U.S. government, whether it be the legislature, the judicial, or the presidency. I mean, less so with the judicial, but more with the legislature and the presidential, the executive branch. But that's something I think recently I read that like 60% of Americans don't know that, which I doubt that. I mean, I can't believe that some people wouldn't know that those are the three branches of government. I mean, come on, man. But anyways, I think when it comes to Putin and his perspective on why he did all this, it's obviously, beyond restoring the glory of the Russian Empire. It is also fueled in large part by his resentment of the fact that Russia has went from being one of the premier powers to being a shell of its former self in every sense of the, understanding of it. I mean, their economy, they were never sort of competing with the U.S., in the same way as China is at the moment in terms of the economic space. The U.S. was in the Cold War always one that, under the capitalist system, providing a sort of, higher standard of material living, and had a lot of soft power in that result. Think of Jeans, Elvis Presley, et cetera, I mean, at the time, which in today's world, I mean, to draw the comparison, I mean, there's some parallels, obviously, but to separate, obviously, then from now, because, I mean, right now, Russia is no longer communist, not even ostensibly, and American soft power is not what it used to be, for better and for worse. I mean, much for worse, I think. And America is demographically and politically, I think, and even culturally, obviously, a much different country than in the 2020s than it was in the 1960s, 1950s, and just the post-war period in general, the immediate post-war period after 1945. And that is just obviously something that it should go without saying, but definitely plays a role in the, determining what will happen next. And when it comes to Putin and I think his decisions here, I think it is fueled by, the resentment he has, which from his perspective, if I were him, is rightfully so had, as, he looks at Russia as, and I'm going to link this below because there's a really good article from the Greek Reporter, and I'm going to read a little bit of it very quickly, just to, provide a little bit of, I think, some, and I mentioned Alexios I, so I mean, some of this might be a reiteration, but I think Russia sees itself as the third Rome, and Putin in particular looks at himself, I mean, comparing himself to Peter the Great should give you the hint, as somebody who's championing Russia's, presence in the world as a major power, as an empire and, sphere of influence in its own right, and obviously in Ukraine, there's been some major setbacks, but when it came to Armenia and Azerbaijan and the situation in Syria, they definitely were, in more of a position to exercise, and they were able to punch up their well above their weight for quite a bit. And I think this Ukraine war is definitely going to change those dynamics, and it's something that we should definitely get back into when it comes to the sort of, how that's going to affect these different theaters. I mean, Syria, I think there's going to be a renewal of tension there, as Bashar al-Assad, his government in Damascus, was reliant on Putin's air support from the Russian military, the Russian Air Force's support, as well as the advisors and whatnot. And I think this is going to give Iran, in particular, the Islamic Republic, more of a window and opportunity to increase its influence at the expense and absence of Russia, due to the fact that they're having to reallocate much of their attention to what's going on in Ukraine, which is, for them, I think, a battle of life and death. And that is something to not, discount or underplay. But really quick, I want to read this article, and then afterwards, I want to talk about, what I think ultimately all this is going to result in the coming weeks and months to the best of my capacity. And for sure, I will definitely revisit this topic in the future, because it is something that is, as I'm speaking, a developing story, and is one that, as of the annexation, as I mentioned earlier in this segment, something that is heating up for sure. And the nuclear threat here, I think, is something that is very real. But to understand all that, I think we need to have, again, a sort of understanding of the past. And this article, which I'll link below, along with other, references, as again I mentioned, so you guys can all, and gals can all, not just take my word for anything, but, educate and do research for yourselves. And I recommend doing so, Don't just take my word or any one particular source, but expand your knowledge, as we want to all be as well-rounded as possible and try to make sense of these things to the best of our ability. But this is the article, and it says, from the Greek Reporter, it's called "Putin Reclaims Byzantium for His New Russian Empire." Putin and Russia are reclaiming the legacy of Byzantium. This is not necessarily a threat, but this is why Byzantium matters. Putin has associated Russia with Byzantium in ways that are apparent to countries with an Orthodox legacy, but are not necessarily clear to the rest of the world. And I think that could quite clearly also be maybe a sort of an implied sort of, jab at America, maybe even as a country that is definitely not one that was Orthodox. I mean, we have plenty of Catholics and Protestants, and there are some Orthodox. I think, there's Russian expatriates here, immigrants, as well as those from other Orthodox countries such as Greece. But definitely collectively, and at least in the political leadership, America was never an Orthodox Christian, country in that sense. But, without further ado, let's get into this article. And this is by Theodore Christou. Russia's two-headed eagle, often worn by Russian athletes on their jerseys, is not a modern invention. It comes down to us through the ages from the glorious days of the Byzantine Empire. If we travel 1800 years back in time, the eagle served as the unmistakable symbol of the Byzantine Empire, and it is still at the core of Orthodox Christianity, including its Greek, Russian, Ukrainian, Romanian churches throughout the world. The great and unmistakable historical importance of the Byzantine Empire is not overlooked by Russia. It has, however, been suppressed or ignored within Western history education. It has been treated this way because it looks to the east, and here in the west, we do not. And just a quick side note, actually. I actually have a huge banner that I was given as a gift from my parents as a Christmas gift a few years ago of the double-headed eagle from Byzantium. Not the Russian one, but the one from the Byzantine Empire. And I'm sure you've seen it all in a few videos if you've watched previous ones I've made. I'll link a couple below for you can see for yourself. I like the aesthetic, and I'm a student of history, much like Putin is. Maybe that's one of the few things I can have a strong agreement with him on when it comes to my opposition to him on foreign policy, but our mutual, passion for history and why it influences both of us. And I'll get into that in a little bit, but let's finish this article. What was Byzantium? In a nutshell, Byzantium was Rome. More specifically, Byzantium was the Rome that existed after Constantine I, 306 to 337. It was actually, 306 to 337 BC. He turned the Roman world from its, quote, pagan, end quote, roots towards Christianity, and after the city of Rome ceased to be the capital of the Roman Empire in 476 AD. And side note, that's not 100% accurate. Maybe de facto, but not de jure. And there's also some, annotations I could add, but we'll talk about in another segment. I'm a huge Byzantophile and Romanophile too. and Grecophile, I guess, a Philhelene to an extent. So that just kind of made me want to just, state that a little bit, because there were other capitals. There was Sirmium, there was Milan, Ravenna, at least in the west. And then, in the east, there were others before Constantinople, too, like Nicomedia and whatnot. But we can talk about that in another segment. Byzantium, and even Antioch, I guess, to a degree. But let's get back into this article. Byzantium was an ancient Greek city that was rebuilt from its very foundations and became an imperial capital under Constantine I. At the time, the Roman Empire extended from the Atlantic Ocean across the entirety of the Mediterranean Sea, including what today is northern Africa, the Middle East, Turkey, and eastern and western Europe, including parts of Ukraine, especially the Crimean Peninsula, which was the Greek colony of Kherson, or Cherson, yes, at the time. And that area is actually a particular area of importance, as I mentioned before, in the current conflict. And, that includes, obviously, the broader Black Sea region. And this would be, obviously, culminating with Constantinople, the great city now called Istanbul, which is the cultural center of Turkey to this day. And Istanbul, I mentioned it in another segment, is the Turkish sort of, adaptation of Istanbul, which in Greek meant to the city, as much like we in New York, or someone like myself from New York refers to New York or Manhattan as the city. Constantinople would be in that same vein. It was the beating heart of Rome, or Byzantium, from 330 until 1453 AD. Putin wants to make Russia the new Byzantium. So why would Russian athletes want to wear Byzantine eagles on the crest of their uniforms? Simply put, Russia wants to be the third Rome. By the time Constantinople was conquered by Ottoman Turks under the leadership of Mehmed II in 1453, after serving for 11 centuries as a Roman capital, Russia had become a central part of the Byzantine alliance. The Russian Czar, a derivative of the Latin term Caesar, or imperial ruler, then assumed or presumed the role of the imperial head of the Roman Empire. And, Russia had its own version of that, the Tsar, based on that, much like the Germans had the Kaiser. But again, let's get into, the rest of this. I don't want to go too much on a tangent. Following the Bolshevik Revolution and the establishment of the Communist Secular United Soviet Socialist Republic in 1922, this imperial legacy was largely lost. Russia reclaims the legacy. However, recently historians have begun to reclaim this important Byzantine history and its Russian legacy. Under Vladimir Putin, Russia has once again begun to portray its history through the lens of Byzantium. Putin has begun to indelibly associate Russia with Byzantium in ways that are apparent to countries with an Orthodox legacy, but are not necessarily clear to the rest of the world. Byzantium matters. It matters if we want to associate Russia today with Imperial Russia at its zenith. If you recognize the double-headed eagle of Byzantium, Russian athletic uniforms over the last decade make a lot of sense. If you do not, it is important then you ask why this symbol does not have as much resonance as the hammer and sickle of the maple or the maple leaf have. Russia is reclaiming the legacy of Byzantium, of Rome, of antiquity, and of Orthodox Christianity. This is not necessarily a threat, but this is why Byzantium matters. As a teacher, educator, a member of the Ontario College of Teachers, and an associate dean of... a Queen and research of Queen's University. This is the author speaking. I strongly believe this history matters. And I believe so too, actually, just my perspective here. And actually, this rest of the essay, I definitely would, actually, should I? I'm at the end of it. Why not? So I just almost got, thrown off here. But, yeah, there's a little bit of personal details that this guy writes about. But let's get back into the last part, I think, the major part that matters, actually, because you can read the whole article yourself, but there's a bit where he talks about a little bit of his background. But I want to not get too sidetracked here, not to undermine his own points when it came to his personal anecdotes. As personal anecdotes are important, and I'm going to get into my own in a little bit, and for the sake of brevity, talk about that quicker than, trying to get into this whole article. But let's get to the last part of this. The lies in our history books. Unexpectedly, as I conducted this project, I learned that our textbook lie. Every publication that I could find relating to the history of education, the philosophy of education, and educational, quote, foundations, end quote, a term that includes sociology, failed to mention Byzantium. The common historical narrative included China, but only sometimes, Greece, Rome, the Dark or Medieval Ages, quote unquote, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and current times. And much like in Canada, as the author is from, it's similar like that in the collective West as a whole. I can tell you as an American, I mean, most people in America are not the keenest when it comes, at least from my experience, on a lot of this history. There are some, but not as many as there should be. And To end this, though, historians periodicize. They artificially create spaces and contexts that will allow them to look back and talk about things that stay the same and things that change over time. Dynasties and confederations emerge, change, fall, and evolve. And we suppress or ignore Byzantine history. The textbooks that I referenced state that Rome was conquered in 476 AD. The city of Rome was indeed conquered on this date, but has long ceased to serve as an imperial capital. And that's true, it was a symbolic capital at that point. At best, Rome wasn't important to memory, to consciousness, and to the western part of Rome, which was largely Latin-speaking, as opposed to the eastern parts of the empire, which had been Hellenized since the days of Alexander the Great, meaning they were fundamentally Greek in linguistic and cultural terms. Putin's Byzantium is alive and well. Again, we suppress Byzantium because it looks to the east and we do not. Byzantium harkens to Russia, which is depicted as corrupt in the athletic and political spheres. It points to Greece, which was economically disadvantaged and wrestling for years in the 2010s under the yoke of economic austerity and concerns about its finances. It alludes to the former Soviet bloc and to the Balkans, which are still wrestling to find their identities. Harkens to the Orientalism that Edward Said pointedly identified, a patronizing depiction of Eastern lands by Western Europeans, whose frame of reference were both imperial and colonial. Russia's are too to agree, but that is definitely the case also for Western Europe and America as well. I mean, any great power, I think, this is just my personal anecdote, is going to exercise some sort of imperial inclinations. But, that could be another discussion, I think, for another time philosophically. But Syed was speaking specifically of the Middle East, but again, this region of the world was a vital part of the Roman and Byzantine worlds. Byzantium is alive and well. One cannot find Byzantium on a map, but its culture persists. Orthodox monasteries, libraries, and churches still exist across Greece, Cyprus, Turkey, and North America. And in the case of Greece, notably Mount Athos. But that was just my personal anecdote. And to end this now, it persists in the constitutions of countries, in the literary traditions and the poetic imagination of millions, and in the worldview formation of more than 250 million people. Byzantium also exists as propaganda, and as a historical bridge between historical spaces and geographical contents. All this we know, and yet we have no reference to point to in our history books, nor do our future teachers and students. And I think that was a good point to end this on, and the article will be linked below. But it references quite a few things that now I would like to get into before I give my final sort of conclusion and prediction here for what's going to happen next. And it is that Putin, he's, whether you check out his article, which I linked below, on his perspective on why Russia is what it is, and is, the champion of Orthodox Christianity. And that is also due to the fact that Vladimir the Great, who was, the leader of the Kievan Rus, had converted to Orthodox Christianity under the auspices of forming an alliance with the then emperor at the time of Byzantium, Vasil II, who reigned, I believe, from 976 to 1025, with, in between, obviously having to battle between Bardas Skleros and Bardas Phokas, who were two generals who were trying to vie to reduce him to being a sort of, puppet, and not, obviously someone who wanted to, remain under the thumb of, generals that were obviously talented, but, in his own right, Basil was a talented general. Basil was talented himself. But in that sense, the rest is then history, as Russia, for the circumstances of political, alliances and being able to have, Basil overcome his enemies in the Byzantine Civil War at the time, Russia was then, brought into the broader Orthodox world and has ever since been, greatly shaped. And there was that time where Peter, obviously, even though he did mirror Constantine with his moving of the capital, he did try to move towards the west and, reform and modernize, in his view, Russia to be more reflective of, Western Europe. Even moving the capital, obviously, to what was St. Petersburg and had been conquered, territory formerly belonging to Sweden. And when it was the when it was the Swedish Empire. But again, and I think it was part of modern Finland, or what was modern Finland today, but correct me if I'm wrong, but that was something that, was an interlude, but ultimately I think is still something when it comes to Putin that really shapes his perspective. And it's something, whether it's through cynical or through, him being, I think, and I do think to a degree, he is a true believer. Obviously, the Byzantine emperors had a life of luxury, and some will, note that Putin has this sort of luxurious life and might be one of the richest people, or if not the richest in the world. That could be the case, but the Byzantine emperors were wealthy and were quite opulent, and something that I don't think that necessarily contradicts or takes away from this sort of thesis of how religion, and in particular Christianity, ties in, as I mentioned in the beginning of the segment, with one's formulation of identity, of what their identity is, and how one looks and interfaces with the world. And much as there's been this constant sort of tension between the East and West, and the Orthodox and the Catholics when it came to the disputes, whether it be through the Byzantines of yesteryear or Russia and its conflicts with the great powers throughout the preceding centuries prior to the end of the Tsarist rule, following the deposition of Nicholas II Romanov, during the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. And thereafter. I think that those things obviously should be kept in mind, but ultimately, zooming out, I think that this is something that is deeply integral to understanding Russia, and it's also resentment of the West. And to get into the crux of this, as somebody who, again, is opposing Putin from a foreign policy point of view, I can definitely sympathize from, if I were him in his shoes, his desire to reunify the Russian motherland and make it whole from his point of view and that of his ancestors and people. He is trying to fill the shoes of his forefathers. And that is something that I mentioned before is never easy to do, regardless of who you are, be it American or Russian or Chinese, etc., etc. You get the idea. And when it comes to Putin in particular, his view of, I think, the West is one of that of being an enemy. And I think that was always the case. And the West was trying to sort of do this charm offensive and woo Russia at the time. There was the G8 and its inclusion in all these sort of Western dialogue and forums and sort of groupings and whatnot. But I think that was sort of just a means to an end, a pretense. And I think that Russia, as much as it enjoyed that sort of thing, I think ultimately was never going to want to exist under the thumb of an American dominated, or even Western more broadly speaking, whether it be America or Britain or any of these others. Britain is obviously sort of a rumps of its former empire with its own issues internally as much as America and the rest of the West. But even with all those, whether it be one of those or the other, Russia sees itself as its own distinct civilization and one that has its own, destiny as a great power and as a superpower. And much like Justinian I had his sort of, dream of reconquering and reconstituting the lost parts of the western half of the Roman Empire, and had been able to partially regain part of it, and how Alexius I had been able to use soft power in a way to be able to keep the, rudder on what was increasingly, I think, over time, the sort of decentralization and problems with the Dunatoi internally, the powerful, these oligarchs who, I think Russia has their own sort of set of them, and some of them have been dying under mysterious circumstances, who have been, criticizing Putin's, foreign policy prerogatives, which could be its own topic. But, and America has its own oligarchs, among others, and as well as China, etc. But just to mention those sort of internal, tensions that were going on. And Putin, in particular, I think, as someone who's now about to turn 70, who is a Libra like myself, and as someone who's not too keen on astrology, but has gotten a little bit more into it due to the recommendation of my girlfriend and a few others, and just, an interest in it, I think that he has, and of all the things I disagree with astrology on, I do think that the symbol of the balance, the scale, is one, having a strong sense of justice, is something that might be the most true of all the other things that I might have some reservations on. And I think with Putin in particular, he shares at least a similar sort of sentiment that I could at least sort of, extrapolate onto my view as an ethnic Korean, as somebody who was brought up in America, considers themselves American first and foremost, and would have a similar sentiment if America was, God forbid, divided. And as someone who looks up to Abraham Lincoln in particular, Lincoln the Unifier, who even dressed as him during Halloween, and is super resentful of anybody, myself, who even jokes or in passing, or even tries to grift off of this idea of a potential second civil war, which I don't think that should ever happen. And I can talk about that in its own segment, which I'll definitely get into. But as somebody who believes in the territorial integrity of the United States and not wanting to secede any part, whether it be Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Alaska, any of these things, or even the, main 50 states, as someone who, if they saw something like that happening, I would want to do everything in my power to encourage that to not happen. I can understand where Putin's coming from, and more so in particular, I think, as an ethnic Korean, second, first and foremost, I'm an American, but when it comes to being an ethnic Korean, which I'll talk about in my own segment, I think, talking about Korea soon enough, but seeing the North and the South divided, the DPRK, which I perceive under the Kim dynasty to be a tyrannical, illegitimate state that's occupying what should be rightfully the territory of the Republic of Korea, based in Seoul. I mean, I would be willing, if given the power and position, to do almost anything. I think anything almost to restore to reunify the Korean Peninsula under one independent and whole Korea. And I believe that the North and South, they are one people. And regardless of the economics or the time passing in between, I think that there is not only a historical precedent, but a spiritual and deep sort of, spiritual and symbolic and just, something that I can feel in my bones that on a personal level, and this could be just me speaking from the gut here, that the division of Korea right now, and I think there's more to than just blaming on Japan, which they definitely are at fault to a degree, and even you can say to a level that America, Russia, and China have had a part in it. But I'd even say going as far back as the internal weaknesses of the Choson dynasty, which had, I think, been internally decaying and had unfortunately adopted a policy post its victory, thanks to Yi Sun-sin and among others, of against Japan in the 16th century, who had, or the 14th century, yes, in particular the 14th, I believe, century, and had then adopted an isolationist foreign policy, which I want to talk about in another segment. Again, there's so many things to talk about, and not enough time, unfortunately. But I'll definitely get into it in another one sometime soon. But I think that there's a lot to do with more than just blaming external powers, and it has much to do with its own internal inadequacies that led to its division. And the fact that I'm here speaking English to you all today and even doing all this is a testament to that. And is also a testament to America's preeminence and the fact that Russia right now, I mean, not that many people outside of Russia want to go and study abroad in Russia as they used to. I mean, many had studied abroad in Russia historically, and some do to a degree. I mean, there are those who from former Soviet states that do. But back during the Soviet Union days, you even had at the time Chiang Ching-kuo, who was the son of Chiang Kai-shek and the leader of nationalist China, who succeeded Sun Yat-sen at the time in the 1920s. He even went to Russia, the Soviet Union, to study, and Russia at the time had far more soft power and was, in a far better and more powerful state from its point of view than it is today. And Putin is seeking to right those wrongs, and I think he has that same passion that I have, at least from my perspective, of reunifying Korea. And I'd love to do it peacefully, but I personally think with Korea, maybe Putin looks at the same way in Ukraine, that there isn't going to be a peaceful sort of reunification or settlement as much as I'd like there to be. It's going to be reunified through the sword, and I think either the North or South is going to do so, and the other is going to be absorbed. And whether it will be Germany, the German or Vietnam model, I mean, will be up for history to decide, and it's something I want to talk about in another segment, as there's tensions there. And North Korea itself is actually collaborating to an extent with Russia as Russia seeks to consolidate its presence on the world stage and to not be isolated itself now, as in lieu of the recent Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting and the UN summits, there is definitely a sense that Russia has lost and a lot of its international clout, and there's even countries that are neutral that are definitely skeptical of its actions. But I don't think that Russia is operating, or neither is Putin, on the auspices of what the rest of the world thinks of it exactly. I mean, obviously they have to take that into consideration when conducting diplomacy, and obviously their foreign policy is definitely shaped by other countries, but I think that their own sense of self and Putin's upbringing as someone who grew up in the crumbling days of the coming of age and what became the sort of shock of Russia's collapse or the Soviet Union's collapse and Russia's reduction to what it is today as a rump state, I think that's something that he sees as a historic wrong that he would like to right. And that is what motivated ultimately his invasion of Ukraine and his ongoing campaign, which, I mean, with Korea, I mean, as much as I'd like to reunify it myself, I mean, I'm just a random person. And on emotion, I'd like to do that. But to take a step back and to look at the practical realities and unfortunately, I think the, risks when it comes to humanity as a whole and the lives at risk here. Obviously, we can have our own, deeply held beliefs, but we should also be able to take a step back and to be introspective, obviously, as well as, to look at the external factors in the world and be sober about them. And that will have to also mean that we have to be also realistic. And I think it's always good to dream. I mean, I'm an idealistic person at my core. And I think Putin is to a level too, as someone, I think everyone who has a deep fascination with history, as I think he clearly does, as even through his, announcement of what was the invasion. I could give you the play-by-plays, obviously, but for the sake of brevity, I mean, at the beginning he gave a speech when he declared the so-called special military operation, which really is a war. I mean, to drop the pretenses. But it's a war nonetheless that he views as a righteous one, that he, obviously likened himself to Peter the Great, and looking at it like looks at it like he is taking back what is rightfully his. But I do think that he should be, warned, obviously. I mean, as he is a Christian, I think it'd be good, for at least my point of view, I doubt he's going to listen to this, to cite, obviously, the 7 deadly sins. And the one I think that most comes to mind in this situation is that of pride. And I think that we are all, especially a man like myself, a man like Putin, a man like anyone who is, considers themselves, a man, I think pride is something that can be a pitfall. And I think pride can sometimes, unfortunately, in its extreme, become conceit, and it must be moderated. And in that case, I think if you look at the situation with Justinian and the Gothic War, I think the Gothic War in particular, to sum this up here, this last point I think is one that definitely needs to be included before I get to obviously the long-awaited prediction I have here, is something that really comes to mind in this situation, as with Putin, I think in particular, trying to retake Ukraine. And I think his goal was to make Kyiv the spiritual sort of capital, with Moscow being the political one in this arrangement. I mean, I'm almost positive, correct me if I'm wrong, there was an article that was set to publish around March 1st that was deleted by Russian-backed media that had announced triumphantly what they predicted by that time to be Ukraine rejoining the Russian motherland, and then having Belarus and Ukraine reunified politically. I mean, Belarus under Lukashenko at this moment is already really a vassal. I mean, and they tried to exercise some independence, but in lieu of the ongoing, unpopularity Alexander Lukashenko has domestically and recent events, they have only further been, gravitating towards this Russian orbit, much to, I'm sure, Alexander Lukashenko's chagrin. And I mean, obviously, there's going to be more to be seen there, as Belarus had a role in the Ukrainian initial invasion and the situation right now that's going on, but hasn't directly, intervened, at least, officially, and mobilized all of its troops, and has its own issues. But when it comes to the Gothic War, getting back to that, to not go too much on a tangent now, as we're over an hour, I think that with Justinian, as he loved Rome so much and grew up in the Balkans, and was someone who was one of the last fluent Latin speakers that had a Western orientation in the eastern part of the Roman Empire. He loved Rome so much that he attempted to restore Italy and the rest of the empire, and assumed that the Italian conquest would be much like his stint in North Africa, which might be more compared, I guess, on a rough level, and maybe it's not as accurate, to the success Putin had in 2014 with Crimea, or maybe even with Georgia, with North Africa. And then his attempt with Italy Justinian had with Italy, it was similarly something that could have almost been, if things were a little bit different with Vitiges, wrapped up a lot sooner and not had devolved into a quagmire. And similarly with Russia and Ukraine, I think that he tried to make this sort of a thing that it was a smash and grab kinda, and it now has resulted in a quagmire. And hopefully, unlike with Justinian, with his inadvertent destruction of the city of Rome through the multiple sieges back and forth between the Ostrogoths under Totila, who is worth his own subject, I think, of talking about, the rebel who had been able to, against Belisarius and then Narses, put up quite the resistance, and had really, if circumstances might have been a little bit different, been able to maybe even prevent the, Romans from being able to retake the Italian province. But in the case of Ukraine, which, I mean, unfortunately for Totila, who didn't have the help of external powers or any sort of, competing superpower. I mean, it's not 100% a parallel, but just to, keep in mind that if the Ostrogoths might have had, significant foreign backing, maybe it would have been different. But in the case of Ukraine, with Zelenskyy, they had been able, Kyiv has, to gain a lot of sympathy and aid, rightfully so, I think, from the West. And right now, obviously, with that being said, maybe it won't be exactly the same, but I have a bad feeling that with Ukraine and maybe even Kyiv, if, sometimes people love something so much that they want it back and don't, really, put into account the risks and the consequences of not performing the, things that performing up to the, what is necessary to ensure that, things don't blow up in one's face. I mean, I guess in lack of a better term, I think that Rome in the same way could be analogous to what's going on in Ukraine. It might be leveled, unfortunately. And that's what brings me to this last part of the segment, and this is my predictions for the future. And I think it's a perfect segue because much like Rome was reduced to ashes, and you had scenes at the time during the sieges where Belisarius was forced, along with his soldiers, to use statues that were, dedicated from times past to defend, and use them as sort of, stopgaps and obstacles to prevent this, besieging forces from, getting at them. I think with Putin in particular, as you saw in Mariupol, which was founded actually by Catherine the Great originally for refugees that were coming from the Ottoman Empire, and had also been a city that had plenty of Russians in it and Russian speakers, had been leveled in the March of earlier this year, and I think it was 2022. I mean, I might have said earlier it was 2021. It's 2022. I mean, where does the time go? I mean, you get my point. I mean, I'm talking about this current year at the moment. I'm recording this in the end of 2022 in October. Or around the end, almost the end of the year. I mean, we're almost at the end. I mean, look at where the time goes. And as the winter comes in, and as we're in the middle of fall, there is that ongoing energy crisis, as I mentioned. And in lieu of the pressures and the recent situation with Nord Stream and the annexations that Putin has of these states, which of these 4 areas of Ukraine in the southeast, which I watched the signing ceremony with all the pomp and circumstance that one would expect. It seemed very Byzantine in a way. He seemed like he had that smug look, like you're not getting this territory back, and I mean that might be the trace. I mean, Henry Kissinger had the former Secretary of State under Nixon, who is still alive in 99. I mean, God bless him for being that old. I mean, for better or for worse, and he's a controversial figure. He had the sort of prediction for Ukraine that I think initially with I think he was being a little bit more candid than some are, and I think practically we're not anywhere near the point where we can de-escalate. But I think what would have been a good way to de-escalate, if we could have in hindsight, would have been for Ukraine to maybe accept parts of the areas that they lost, like Crimea and the Donbass, to go to Russia, for them to save face, and then for the rest of Ukraine to have been sort of de facto a part of NATO and then given the sort of security umbrella. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case. And maybe if we were better and the U.S. wasn't, along with the broader West, not in such an identity crisis ourselves, Putin might have not seen sort of perceived a moment of weakness that he could have exploited. I mean, as someone, again, who is an enemy of the West and as someone who looks at the West as an enemy, from his perspective, I mean, if you understand, as I mentioned before, the historical context, it is understandable from his view. It's regrettable. I mean, I know there's a lot of Americans who wish that Russia and America could have this sort of alliance, maybe against China, like the realist school of thought from folks like John Mearsheimer, who is, a little bit too cozy with the Russians from my point of view, but is someone who does think has some worthwhile analysis, but definitely is somebody, I think, that has a sort of conflict of interest there, as he had visited Russia and Putin quite a few, and has met Putin in person. It's quite friendly with him. But, that aside, when it comes to ultimately the situation here with Vladimir Putin and the Russian Federation, I think that as of their annexation of this territory, this is the sort of pretense that was set up, at least from their point of view, to legitimize, at least through their domestic audience, the situation that they've been, this conflict that was, I mean, it's quote-unquote special military operation, but I'm sure many domestic viewers are willing to acknowledge, I mean, if they're even halfway paying attention in Russia, and they're being honest, at least to themselves, that this is an all-out war. And I mean, America really is de facto at war, at least from the proxy level with Russia. I mean, and I think that there's a chance still that this could escalate where NATO and America might directly get involved, depending on what happens next. And I think from my prediction here, hear me now, quote me later, and maybe if I'm wrong, I'll gladly concede. I'd like this not to be the case, but I think that this conflict is escalating to the point where I think we are definitely going to see, actually, not might, the first tactical nuclear weapons being used in anger. And since the last time nuclear weapons were just used in general, which was during Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II, which I think, again, was the right decision from the American point of view. I could talk about that in another segment, but when it came to that, and Japan, obviously, the Japanese Empire, that was used to end World War II in the Pacific theater. That is something I think that is going to be something that, and I don't think it's going to be 100% the same, but I think that the situation is playing out where Russia is going to have the same incentives to do what America did to, if anything, they view nuclear weapons in a weird way, I think, as a form of being able to maybe de-escalate and to get the West to back off and to stop funding Ukraine. Putin, I think, is definitely read Machiavelli, Niccolo Machiavelli, and the Prince, and I think he's also hoping maybe for a black swan event, maybe something like the West in another means or another, some contingency where the West stops supporting Ukraine because the West is still doing so and has remained a unified front, which is something I think that the Russians, Putin wasn't expecting, the Kremlin as a whole wasn't expecting. And the level of sanctions being, launched at Russia, I think, is something that has been quite significant. And Russia's been able to do all sorts of things with the ruble and, sort of stabilize their economy to some level. But I think that it's definitely far more severe than they'll ever want to, or they'll ever admit, at least publicly, obviously, in terms of not being willing to not save face, and also just not conceding, at least on the public relations ground, which is a battlefield in and of itself, the gravity of how badly these sanctions are having a damage on Russia as Western businesses had fled. And, you saw famously that chubby guy, I think, chained to a McDonald's at one point, and them having to rebrand, it's like McDonald's to Vanya or Uncle Vanya's or something along those lines, or they've been have to, they left, they've had to completely sort of reconfigure their economic structure, and even the business the consumer businesses there have been impacted. That's something that should not be lost on us, and is something that I think is pressure on Putin, but nonetheless, I think Russia has a more autarkic sort of system. Not entirely, obviously. They're not like North Korea by any means, even though some compare them to them. Some observers will, I think, mistakenly compare North Korea to Russia. Even with these severe sanctions, Russia has a vast amount of territory and natural resources, and has plenty of countries such as Eritrea, Venezuela, North Korea, India, and China to an extent. I mean, and even Syria, obviously, too, and Armenia, and some others. They're still willing to, in some ways, whether it be through India and China, buying oil from Russia at a discount. And China, in the case, I think, is now selling back that oil to the European Union marked up, which is a topic in and of itself, but is just typical of Beijing, unfortunately. But in the case of even India, which is historically been an ally and major military, and saw Russia as the Soviet Union as a major military supplier, with its own disputes against Pakistan during the Cold War and even up until this day, with the region of Kashmir, and that sort of thing, and Jammu, which is something that we could talk about in its own segment, but. And even Vietnam and Cuba, I believe. I mean, Russia has still some countries still that are willing to, in some ways or another, consort with them and collaborate. Which, I mean, I'm going to leave my opinions on that for another segment, and that's not even to try to, regardless of my opinions, put a value judgment on that. But that's something that needs to be kept in mind, as Russia is the largest country in the world by land, and might not economically be comparable to the U.S., but still, I think, is not to be discounted, and is still the one that has a country that has the largest amount of active nuclear weapons, with the United States obviously being a close second. And that brings me to the prediction here. I think with the nuclear weapons here, Russia, with the annexation of these territories, provided Zelenskyy remains, defiant and is not willing to de-escalate himself, I don't think Putin is, and I think understandably so with Zelenskyy in his perspective. I mean, with all the sacrifices made by the Ukrainian resistance, it would be, I think, completely, a it would be unthinkable from a legitimacy perspective, and even just from a personal perspective, to just surrender even an inch of territory after all that they went through, which I think at this point, it's like the equivalent, I guess a good analogy would be, of a roller coaster where the brakes are, the machines that control it are not working, and this thing is on the rail, it's going off the rails, and it's just a matter of how fast and how furious, unfortunately, if you get my reference, but these things are not looking good. And I think from the situation, as I mentioned before, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, this is going to be seen as peanuts, and there's going to be a backlash. I recently listened to a decent video, or watched one from a certain analyst by the name of James Kerr-Lindsay, who I recommend his segment if you want to see the more Western-focused sort of perspective and the potential outcomes that might come from this. But needless to say, I mean, regardless if you check it out or not, this will fundamentally change the geopolitical landscape and the trajectory of human history, and especially history in the 21st century, as it will be taught in the future, provided there is a future for humanity and those who are going to be interested enough, such as ourselves, to study it forever. And I think that Putin is being backed into a position where, along with Zelenskyy, where they cannot back down, and they have their own political incentives to both keep this thing ramped up and to further, ramp up the pressure and to escalate here. And this, I don't think, is going to end well. This is going to result, I think, in a nuclear conflagration where I don't think it's going to be, as James Kerr-Lindsay had said in his segment and others have, a, strategic nuclear weapon, like, bombing a city in the case of what happened in World War II. I think this is going to be along the lines of a tactical strike that might be done on a contingent of soldiers, such as maybe the ones trying to retake Kherson. And I think what might be the case is in my prediction, if Ukraine continues its campaign as it has and vowed to take back every inch of land, including Crimea itself, which I think is going a little bit far there when it comes to what's realistic and practical. And I don't think Russia could even, or Putin himself, and no matter who would be in charge, if it was not Putin, even if it was somebody else, would be, whether it be Navalny or someone, regardless of what he says, would be able to accept the loss of Russia's base for its Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol, which was the Crimean Peninsula, more broadly speaking. And Kherson is key, an integral part, as another person that I like to watch, Shervan from Catastrophe Report, has talked about in the past about the, water supply, guaranteeing it to Ukraine, which Kherson is crucial to ensuring that. I think that if Ukraine continues to do what it has done successfully in Kharkiv in the southeast and retake Kherson, or look like it's going to be poised to do so, which it could very well might with the backing of U.S. weapons. And I think there is a timer, and I think that both sides are looking for, in the case of Putin, for some sort of event to maybe hinder, whether it be the re-election of a rogue political figure that might buck the trend, especially in the United States. I think he's hoping maybe in 2024, if this thing drags out, for a political official that might be more amenable to forcing Zelenskyy to compromise or be less stalwart in backing Ukraine. Maybe not even Trump. I mean, I'm not sure Trump. I mean, some might say, oh, he definitely would. I don't think he would, honestly, based off of his previous foreign policy decisions. You can criticize him for a lot. I don't think he would, or DeSantis in particular, and God forbid DeSantis becomes president. I mean, listen, he makes Trump look. I can't believe I'm saying this, but compared to Trump, DeSantis, oh my God, don't get me started with him. But I'll talk about him in another segment. I definitely want to lay in on him with the recent situation with the Hurricane Ian, but that's another topic. But I think regardless of who's at the helm, I think that there's going to be I think Putin's hoping for it, but I think that might be maybe a little bit incentivizing, because who knows what will happen in the next couple of years. But I think he's hoping for something along those lines, with maybe someone more amenable to compromising if the circumstances become more intense, and if the winters get cold with the energy crisis with the EU. I think that there are countries like Germany and France that have even still made rumblings, folks like Macron and Schultz, about sort of allowing Putin to save face. And I know that some are criticizing it. I understand where the criticisms come from, and this is why I'm torn, because to some level, I think that if he's not allowed to save face, he's going to use the nukes, I think, to try to get Ukraine to stop. And I think to try to stop taking back the territory that I think is, from my perspective, and I think for many from America, their rightful territory. But whatever we think, I don't think actually quite matters on an individual level. I think what really needs to be analyzed, as I said before, is the cold, hard reality of the situation. And in the realm of international relations here, we're taking no prisoners. And I think Putin in particular is not going to take prisoners, in the sense that he is going to be willing to go as far as he needs to ensure the territorial integrity and future of Russia as what he believes to be as great of a power as it can be, at least as long as he's at the helm. And I think that many hardliners and people that might succeed Putin in the lieu of him maybe being ousted would share those sentiments. I think this goes beyond him as a particular individual and goes to Russia as a, civilizational entity. And I think that it would never want to be under the thumb of the U.S. And I mean, right now it looks like it's poised to be super reliant on China, which is a discussion that I'd like to get into in its own segment. I mean, there's much to be discussed there for sure. But I think with Putin in particular, and the irony that it's like a reverse Peter the Great, where Peter the Great looked towards Europe, Putin is now increasingly looked towards the East, with countries like Vietnam, North Korea, China, and India being those that he's looked towards to collaborate with on various economic and, social, economic and political and diplomatic, I guess diplomatic and political are sort of similar. I mean, they're both in the same. I mean, diplomatic is political. I mean, that's what I'm trying to say. Sort of, I guess, collaborations, in lack of a better term. And that can be talked about in its own segment. And is something that we should look at soberly. But the reality is here, I think, is things are only going to get hotter and hotter from here. And this sort of quote-unquote second Cold War might heat up to the point where it's at the point now where it's beyond de-escalating. And unfortunately, I think that everyone caught in the middle here, the average Ukrainian and Russian people, as well as people here like myself in America who wish that this never happened, but I think for circumstances beyond any person's desires or beliefs was set to happen given the circumstances. And I think that Putin's own, patriotic and I guess ultra-nationalist inclinations, I don't even think he's an ultra, maybe more of a nationalist, take your pick, obviously. I mean, if you disagree with me, let me know on any of these points. I want to hear what you have to say, and I mean, I'm actively learning and trying to keep up with all these things while I can, but I think that he is, fueled by this sense of destiny and is something that, along with others of similar mindset of his, the generation that grew up and came of age at the time that they did in the 80s, I think that this is something that is only set to get more intense from here on out. And hopefully this is something that, maybe I'm wrong about, because I'd like to be, but I don't see how, given the circumstances right now. I mean, I think what Kissinger said originally with the, conceding of certain territories and maybe allowing Russia to, wind down and save face on some level. I mean, they claim right now after these annexations that they're willing to talk peace on some level, but I'm not too sure if that is genuine. And even if that is, I mean, this could just then devolve into a sort of, I'd say, unless NATO is willing to guarantee the rest of Ukraine's integrity there. And I think still with Zelenskyy, if he's willing to accept that, I just don't see that happening, honestly, because of what's at stake and what Ukraine has went through. I mean, thousands of their own soldiers, men and even women have died through this, and civilians. And I mean, war is brutal. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, this isn't a child's play here. This is a serious thing. And I think that so much is at stake, and the future of the world right now as a whole is being decided. And this is something, again, that fascinates me and also horrifies me, but it's something that I believe needs to be kept up with, and is something, as you can see right now, I am talking about on the fly, off the cuff, and definitely for sure I'm going to revisit again in segments in the future. But hopefully this was something that has, at least to some level, elucidated you all to the present, situation here, and what is really going to be the moment of truth. And this is something I think that is going to be happening sooner rather than later. I think that there is a small chance that this could be a sort of frozen conflict that might drag out, much like the Gothic War a la Justinian and Totila, or maybe Belisarius and Totila in terms of the direct combatants, and then eventually Narses. But I think that at least as it stands right now, and I could be corrected as things develop, and they have been developing quite rapidly, I think that there's something's got to give right now, and that we're reaching quickly a breaking point where there's going to be a major escalation, I think, of the scale that's going to shape the future of humanity, and has already been something that I think has had reverberating effects in the surrounding areas, but is going to have implications, especially if nuclear weapons are used in anger in any capacity, for the future in terms of not just what happens with Ukraine and Russia, or America and Russia, but even smaller countries that have conflicts with each other, such as Pakistan, India, North and South Korea. I mean, the legitimate Korea, I'd say, is the the latter Korea, the Republic of Korea, not the North. But that's just my personal take, and even others too. I mean, this is something. I mean, might even have to be sort of I guess stated a little bit that nuclear weapons, and this, especially if they're used, might be something that causes a domino effect, which encourages other states to be convinced that the only way to prevent invasions from neighbors that they might have, sort of revanchist claims or grievances in some sort of capacity. And there's plenty of countries that fell into that category. They might think that having nuclear weapons is the only way to guarantee the, integrity, the political integrity of their respective regimes. And I'm not using the regime term in a negative or positive. I'm just using it in a neutral sense. Just, a brief disclaimer. But that is something that definitely could be, a consequence of this, and is something that should be kept in mind, as much as it might be something that might be an uncomfortable thought. But again, this show and podcast as a whole is meant to dive into these topics, and hopefully this was something of benefit to you all. And I'm looking forward to hearing what you all have to say about this, especially if you disagree. And if you enjoyed this, please make sure to subscribe on YouTube, like on YouTube as well, and comment. And then as well, if you're listening to this on a podcast app, make sure to grab the RSS feed, subscribe as per where it's applicable, and then make sure to share this podcast with your friends and family, and to do your own due diligence and research after this on these topics. I'll include some resources below, as I mentioned, but I definitely recommend you all do your you do what it takes in your own right to keep up to this, as much as I will be myself, and I definitely plan on revisiting this sometime soon. But for now, this has been Tom for Get Nuanced with TJC, and to end this off, I would like to say again, thank you all for tuning into this segment. I'll catch you all in the next one I make real soon. For now, peace out.